Hi, my name's Lily and I left Tanglin in 2007. I'm now about to become head of languages at a secondary school in Clapham in London. Tanglin was extremely formative in my love of languages. Not only was it an environment that really supported language learning in being able to study two from year seven, as well as having great teachers that were talented and enthusiastic enough to create a real love for European languages in me, despite us being in a school in Southeast Asia. After leaving Tanglin, I went to another school called Anglo-Chinese International, where I was the only student doing higher Spanish and French, due to the school having a largely Singaporean population who had never studied a European language before. This essentially was like tutoring, as it was one-on-one lessons with a native speaker. While of course this is a benefit that I think is not something everyone can have access to, I would really recommend trying to get a tandem partner or setting up some kind of a conversation practice club after school, as speaking and listening are some of the hardest skills in languages, and speaking is definitely something that most people feel nervous doing. So if it's something that you can get practice doing now, that will really set you up well later in life. Another thing that I did at the school, which was a benefit, was I decided that I would volunteer to tutor some of the students who were doing beginner French and Spanish. A famous French moralist and essayist, Joseph Joubert, was right when he said to teach is to learn twice, as tutoring really gave me insight into both the areas I was struggling with, as well as the areas other people might struggle with when trying to learn a language for a second language. This is definitely something I would recommend for anyone who's thinking about pursuing languages or pursuing teaching. Upon finishing my IB, I went to the University of Edinburgh to study French and Spanish language, literature and culture. It involved reading dozens and dozens of books in the target language, studying the culture and politics, as well as the language and linguistics and grammar. There were many societies based around the subjects as well that I chose to join during my time at university, which I felt were of great benefit in terms of appreciating the wider culture around those languages rather than just speaking the languages themselves, such as French wine tasting, cinema clubs. There were many, many different options of things that you might choose to join. Another reason why I chose to go to Edinburgh is because if you study languages, it's always a 4-year course, as you have to do your year abroad. In Scotland, all university courses are 4 years anyway, so it meant that you would be able to graduate with the people that you met and the friends that you made in freshers year. It also means that you graduate with an MA rather than a BA for doing the same number of years as you would in an English university anyway. Edinburgh as well, also being a capital city and being a centre for renowned for the arts, meant that I was always sure to find people, activities, events that would interest me. During my year abroad, I decided that I would both work and study, which is an option that you have. I chose to do a European exchange program for universities, which is called Erasmus, and I also chose to become an English language assistant. As I knew that I wanted to be a teacher from a very young age, having had great teachers in Tanglin and ACS and within my own family, I applied through the British Council's Comenius programme. Here you give preferences on the type of city or school that you would like to go to, and they place you in a school in any French-speaking country. I almost went to the Reunion Island, for example, which is an island off the coast of Africa. But in the end, I ended up going to a school just outside of Rouen, which is in Upper Normandy, France. This school was a part vocational, part high school, which meant that I was teaching English to both secondary age students as well as to adults who are trying to learn to become technicians and mechanics. This is not an area of English, especially French, that I understand well. So this was something that really challenged me to go home and to study in my own time to ensure that I was providing those students with the best learning that they could possibly get. This is definitely a skill that I would recommend to anybody who's looking to become a teacher, is always thinking about which areas you could improve on. I made some great friends as well while I was living in France, who were both teachers at my school, as well as people who I met by going to bars and joining sports clubs. It can be a nerve-wracking thing moving to a new country, especially when you're going there to try and learn a new language. But it's definitely something that a lot of people in those countries are very open to. I would just recommend joining as many groups and going to as many social things as you can. Potentially trying to find someone that you work with who would be able to go with you if you need that sort of security blanket. But I made many friends while I was living there, and these are friends who I still speak to 6 or 7 years later and who I've been back to visit a few times. After leaving France, I then went to Spain to do my Erasmus program, which is a university exchange program within Europe. It's a great program because it means you can go to any university in Europe, and that you also get some financial support for doing that. I was placed in the University of Valladolid, which I didn't know much about before I went, but it ended up being a great blessing, as Valladolid was the old royal capital of Spain, and nowadays is said to have some of the easiest to understand, and best spoken traditional Spanish with no accent or slang. So it ended up being great in terms of improving my language. There were also several other people from my university that were placed there, which meant I had a solid friendship group. I decided that I would choose a well-rounded course program while I was there. I chose to study the history of Spain, Baroque theatre, and linguistics. These were all relevant to my university degree, so I felt like it would be useful to see them being taught in the target language in those countries through their perspective. I also chose to live with a Spanish-speaking person, with a native Spanish speaker. And this was also great in terms of my practice of Spanish. Also great in terms of I really got to see what it was like living with Spanish people and doing what Spanish people typically do. Quite a lot of people went into the security bubble of living with other people doing the Erasmus program. And I think that this was something that they may have potentially missed out on. So while it may be nerve-wracking, I really would suggest spending as much time with native speakers as you can while you're in the country. I also chose to do things like traveling around the country using apps like BlaBlaCar, which is a carpooling app where conversation is encouraged between the passengers and the drivers. And they would obviously be able to give you great tips in terms of where to go and would be great practice for your spoken language. I also chose to try and teach part-time while I was there doing my university degree. I advertised this on Facebook and in forums and was able to find many different students doing that. Again, solidifying my spoken Spanish, my spoken English, as well as my ability to understand how to teach languages, which is something that would definitely help me later down the line. Upon graduating from Edinburgh, I moved back to Spain and back to Valladolid. Here I carried on being an English language assistant. There are many, many different organizations that you can apply to for teaching English as a conversation assistant or as a teacher. I applied to one called Activa, which has sites all across Spain. I was then placed in 2 or 3 schools as a conversation assistant, teaching all sorts of age groups between 2 to 18. This again was massively beneficial for me moving into a secondary school where you're teaching people from 11 to 18 in terms of understanding how to pitch lessons, what level of difficulty, what areas they might struggle with most, despite it being a different language. I also never rested on my laurels. If there was anything I didn't understand in terms of English grammar that I was having to teach, I would definitely go home and study it in depth to make sure I felt confident being able to teach that and answer any kind of questions about it, which I think is a great skill both as a teacher and as a lifelong learner in general. After that year teaching English, I decided to move to a small beach town in the south of Spain for the summer in a region called Andalusia. If you know anything about Spain and Andalusia, you'll know that the south is quite well known for its very strong accent and for its slang. I joked that it was my baptism of fire of being able to call myself a fluent second language speaker. If I could understand it there, I could understand it anywhere. And that definitely did prove to be the case. But it was such a lovely experience living somewhere so different to the north, which is slightly more reserved and serious. I also got to experience many of Spain's cultural tropes with an authentic edge rather than seeing them through the eyes of tourist attractions that you'd see in other big cities. I then decided that I wanted to move back to the UK to pursue teaching full time. I went through the PGCE route, which is the more university-based route, where you spend quite a significant amount of time in university and writing theses versus the 2 sort of more professional routes into teaching, which is Schools Direct and SCIT. I enjoyed the university aspect as I wanted to try a different university, and I went to Durham University, but I've known people that did the Schools Direct and SCIT routes who appreciated that process just as much. When applying for my first job, I applied really while taking into consideration the wider aspects of the school that would benefit me, such as did they have a program for NQTs, newly qualified teachers. The school that I applied for did. It had a very wide one that in fact that incorporated teachers from other schools and incorporated many SCIT students. So I felt that this was the right move for me, and it definitely was. I had a very successful NQT year and ended up being promoted to head of Spanish the next year. I think while it's very important when you're in your jobs to show as much ambition as you can, and I did this by applying for several different roles. Whether or not you get them, it shows that you're committed to the staff, you're committed to the school, and that you're somebody that they can rely on for taking on additional responsibility. While in the school, I also had fielded many questions from my students about translation. While this was an area that I did know something about, I didn't know about it in a very deep way to be able to provide insight into what it looks like as a career, what it looks like in practice, what it looks like in terms of live interpretation. This then became something that I researched a lot more. For Tanglin, told me about the grant that they are awarding for alumni in terms of career development. I then applied for that, was able to catch up with Mr. Allen, who taught me while I was at Tanglin, and was lucky enough to receive that grant. And I'm now going to be going on to be doing a master's in translation in February next year, something which I think will help me both as a teacher and being able to support my students to understand that process a lot better, as well as potentially offer me freelance opportunities or a different career path in the future if I decide to make that journey. I hope that this has been useful to anybody who study languages and to anybody who's thinking about going into teaching. My main summaries would be lifelong learning. Don't let the learning stop once you leave school. Challenge yourself to admit where you may be ignorant or unsure on certain issues, and then pursue learning to correct that. Be ambitious, be bold, and go after the things that you want. Of course, always with courtesy and professionalism. And then be well-rounded. Pursue all facets of something and of life in general. Grab every bull by the horns and try everything once. You never know what passions you might get. Thank you.